My name is Sarah. I am 34 years old, and I was sitting in the most ridiculously plush leather chair I had ever seen, watching the color completely drain from my mother's face until she looked like a ghost. Across the massive mahogany table, my brother David, a 38-year-old man who always prided himself on being in absolute control, was trembling so hard his coffee spilled all over his expensive suit. We were in the penthouse office of the city's most prestigious corporate law firm, a place my family used to command with an iron fist. Today, they had been summoned here, desperately hoping for a miraculous bailout from an anonymous billionaire who had secretly bought the massive debt of our failing family empire. They had absolutely no idea who this mystery savior was. They certainly had no idea that the savior was Arthur, the humble 75-year-old janitor my brother had brutally fired 10 years ago for spilling a single drop of water on his shoes. And they absolutely had no idea that Arthur had left his unimaginable fortune to the daughter they had thrown away like garbage a decade ago. The lawyer cleared his throat, looked at me, and began to read the will, while I braced myself for the explosion.
To understand how we ended up in this bizarre room, I need to take you back 10 years. My mother, Eleanor, who is now 62 years old, was the matriarch of our family's massive real estate company. She was a woman made entirely of ice and calculating ambition. Affection in our mansion was a strict transaction. You earned love by obeying commands and looking perfect at charity galas. My brother David was her golden child, molded into a ruthless corporate shark from the moment he could walk. I was the constant disappointment. I didn't care about profit margins. I wanted to be a teacher and work with underprivileged children. Every time I mentioned my dreams, my mother would look at me with profound disgust, as if I had tracked mud across her white carpets.
The breaking point happened on a freezing Tuesday evening in November. I was 24 years old at the time, and I had just received my official acceptance letter for a highly respected teaching program. I was so incredibly happy that my hands were shaking. I literally ran down the sweeping marble staircase of our mansion, foolishly hoping my mother would smile and say she was proud of me. Instead, I found her and David sitting in the formal dining room, sipping wine and going over eviction documents. I excitedly showed them the letter. My mother didn't even read it. She placed her crystal glass on the table, looked me dead in the eye, and told me that if I accepted that program, I would be cut off entirely, not just financially, but completely erased from the family tree. She said I was an absolute embarrassment, a weak link in a strong chain. David laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound that I can still hear ringing in my ears. He looked at me with pure contempt and told me I wouldn't last a single week in the real world without their platinum credit cards.
A million chaotic questions exploded in my head. Every happy childhood memory I had desperately tried to hold on to now felt like a manufactured lie. Was I an absolute fool for thinking they could ever love me for who I genuinely was? A deep, freezing chill crept slowly up my spine, not out of fiery anger, but out of pure, devastating humiliation. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, desperately searching for any tiny trace of maternal warmth in her cold eyes, but there was absolutely nothing there, just a blank, calculating stare. It broke my heart in a profound way that I honestly didn't think was humanly possible. I realized right then that I was never a beloved daughter to her. I was just a poorly performing financial asset. I didn't scream or beg. I just slowly turned around, walked up to my massive bedroom, and packed a single cheap duffel bag with a few basic clothes and my identification documents. I walked straight out the heavy front door into the freezing rain, leaving my car keys and phone on the table.
The first few weeks of my new reality were a waking nightmare. I had exactly $50 in crumpled cash in my pocket and nowhere to go in a city that eats the poor alive. I wandered the wet streets for hours before finally calling the only person I genuinely trusted, my college friend, Mia. Mia is a 34-year-old woman now, but at the time, she was also just 24, struggling to survive on a meager waitress salary. When I called her crying from a payphone, Mia didn't hesitate for a single second. She told me to come over immediately and let me crash on the lumpy couch in her tiny studio apartment. The transition was violently brutal. I went from having a private chef cooking organic meals to eating cheap instant noodles twice a day just to survive. I had to drop out of my dream teaching program because I couldn't afford the tuition. I managed to get a grueling job as a dishwasher at a greasy diner that stayed open all night. My hands quickly became cracked, covered in blisters, and permanently smelling of bleach and old grease. For 5 incredibly long, agonizing years, my daily routine was absolutely brutal and mind-numbing. I would wake up hours before the sun, shivering in the cold apartment, and take 2 different unreliable buses to the diner. I would stand on my aching feet for 12 grueling hours in a tiny kitchen that felt like a blazing furnace. The heat was suffocating, the chefs were always yelling, and the endless piles of dirty plates never seemed to stop. After my shift, smelling like stale onions, I would take 2 buses back home, often falling asleep against the cold window. I would collapse onto Mia's worn-out couch, my whole body screaming in pain, my mind completely numb from exhaustion. There were many lonely nights when the physical and emotional weight was so heavy that I would just lay there in the dark, silent, hot tears streaming down my face. I would constantly think about my mother and David sleeping peacefully in their comfortable beds, probably never spending a single second wondering if I was alive. But every time I felt like giving up, Mia would sit beside me and remind me I was stronger than I knew.
It was during my 5th year of living this exhausting life, when I was 29 years old, that my path unexpectedly crossed with Arthur again. Arthur had been the head janitor at our family's massive corporate headquarters for as long as my memory could reach back. Even when I was a little girl running around the sterile office building, Arthur was always there, quietly sweeping the floors with a gentle, reassuring smile on his wrinkled face. He always managed to have a sweet butterscotch candy hidden in his pocket for me. He were a deeply sweet, incredibly quiet man who never bothered anyone. One miserable, pouring rainy evening, after a particularly horrific shift at the diner, I was walking slowly to the bus stop, completely drenched. Through the heavy rain, I saw a hunched figure sitting on a wet, miserable bus bench. It was an old man, shivering violently in a thin jacket, holding a small cardboard box filled with a few personal belongings. As I got closer, my heart completely stopped beating. It was Arthur. He was 70 years old at the time, looking incredibly frail, lost, and completely broken by the world. I grabbed his freezing arm, pulled him up from the bench, and practically dragged him into a nearby brightly lit coffee shop. I bought him a steaming cup of tea, sat him down, and gently asked him what on earth had happened. With a violently trembling voice and heavy tears forming in his faded blue eyes, Arthur explained the absolute nightmare of his day. He told me that my arrogant brother David had fired him that very afternoon. The reason was so absurd it made my blood boil. Arthur had been carrying a bucket of soapy water to mop the grand lobby, and a single tiny drop of water had splashed onto David's imported leather shoes as he brushed past him. David, completely lacking any human empathy, threw a massive screaming fit right in the middle of the lobby. He viciously humiliated Arthur in front of the entire staff, calling him useless, and fired him on the exact spot without a single dime of severance pay. Even worse, he immediately stripped Arthur of the company-owned apartment he had lived in for decades, giving him exactly 1 hour to pack his things. Arthur had given 40 loyal years to that soulless company, and they threw him away like rotten trash. I sat there, staring across the small table at Arthur, this gentle old man who had always shown me simple kindness when my own wealthy parents were far too busy counting their millions to notice me. The decision was instantaneous. I reached across the table, grabbed his shaking hands, and told him with absolute certainty that he was coming home with me. When we finally arrived at the tiny apartment, dripping wet from the rain, Mia was understandably surprised. But the moment I explained the horrific situation, her heart completely melted just like mine had. We immediately set up a small folding cot in the corner of our cramped living room for Arthur to sleep on. It was incredibly tight and uncomfortable, but the apartment was warm, dry, and safe. Over the next few weeks, Arthur seamlessly became a permanent, beloved fixture in our struggling home. He fiercely insisted on helping out however he physically could. While Mia and I were out working our exhausting jobs, Arthur would clean the tiny apartment until it sparkled and always have a hot, delicious homemade soup simmering on the stove waiting for us when we walked through the door. As the years slowly passed, our makeshift family grew incredibly close, forming a bond stronger than any steel. Arthur organically became the loving, attentive father figure I never really had the chance to know.
My own biological father had passed away when I was very young, and Arthur filled that massive, aching void in my heart with his gentle wisdom, his endless patience, and his warm presence. We would sit up late into the night, sitting on the floor drinking generic tea. He would tell me beautiful stories about his youth, about the wife he had loved and lost, and about the deep joys of a quiet life. He never once complained about his current situation of living on a cot in a poor neighborhood. He never spoke with a single ounce of bitterness about my cruel brother or my icy mother. He just constantly radiated a pure gratitude for the small, warm space we shared together. He would always look at me with those kind eyes and say, "Family isn't about the blood flowing in your veins, Sarah. It's about exactly who holds your hand when the road gets dark and terrifying." Those profound words became my absolute anchor in a chaotic, painful world.
Eventually, through sheer willpower and endless exhaustion, things actually started to look up for me and Mia. I managed to scrimp and save enough crumpled bills to take a rigorous night course in medical office administration. It was exhausting, studying after washing dishes all day, but it paid off. I landed a very decent, respectful job as a front desk receptionist at a friendly community health clinic. It wasn't my ultimate dream of being a school teacher, but it paid the bills much easier, gave us desperately needed health insurance, and allowed us to finally move out of the damp studio into a slightly larger, cleaner 2-bedroom apartment. The absolute best part of the move was that we were finally able to give Arthur his very own bedroom. Seeing the pure joy on his wrinkled face when he realized he had a real bed to sleep in and a small window to look out of was easily one of the greatest moments of my entire life. I finally felt a deep sense of peace settling over me. I didn't need the millions of dollars my family hoarded. I was genuinely rich in the things that actually mattered. But life, as I have painfully learned, has a very cruel, unpredictable way of violently testing your strength right when you finally think you found solid ground. Shortly after Arthur turned 74 years old, he started getting noticeably sick. It didn't happen all at once. It started with a quiet, persistent cough that he tried to hide from us, then evolved into severe, debilitating fatigue that kept him in bed for days. Soon, after a terrifying trip to the emergency room, he was officially diagnosed with an advanced, aggressive lung disease. The doctor sat me down and gently told me that there wasn't much they could realistically do at his advanced age. The only option was to manage his pain and keep him comfortable for whatever time he had left. My beautifully rebuilt world shattered all over again into a million pieces. Mia and I immediately took turns taking unpaid time off from our jobs to care for him around the clock. We carefully bathed him, fed him warm broth spoon by spoon, and sat by his side reading his favorite books to him for hours. Watching this formerly strong, deeply independent man slowly wither away was easily the most excruciatingly painful experience of my entire life. During his final, agonizingly slow days on this earth, Arthur was heavily medicated with painkillers just to breathe, but he still had brief, beautiful moments of profound clarity. One rainy evening, the exact kind of evening when I first found him on that bench, I was sitting quietly beside his bed, gently holding his fragile, thin hand in mine. The hospital room was completely silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor tracking his fading life. Arthur slowly fluttered his eyes open, looked deeply at me with a soft smile, and weakly squeezed my fingers. "You saved me, my sweet Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely more than a fragile breath catching in his throat. "You took in an old, completely useless man who had nothing, and you gave him a beautiful family." I immediately broke down, crying so incredibly hard that my chest heaved. I kissed his hand and told him fiercely that he wasn't useless, that he was the absolute best thing that had ever happened to me. He just smiled that gentle smile, slowly closed his tired eyes, and quietly told me that everything was going to be perfectly taken care of. He passed away peacefully later that exact same night in his sleep. The immediate grief that followed his death was an absolute physical weight pressing down hard on my chest every single day. I couldn't force myself to eat. I couldn't manage to sleep. The apartment, which used to feel so warm and full of life, now felt suffocatingly empty without his reassuring presence, without the familiar smell of his cooking or the gentle sound of his quiet laughter. Mia and I arranged a very small, simple funeral for him at a modest cemetery outside the city.
It was just the two of us standing there in the cold, biting wind beside his open grave. I stood there staring at the wooden casket, thinking about how incredibly unfair and cruel the world truly was. A man with such a golden heart was being buried with nobody but two struggling women to mourn his passing, while my absolutely heartless family continued to live in their massive mansion, completely untouched by the suffering of the real world. I felt a deep, dark anger at the absolute injustice of it all welling up inside me. But I forced myself to swallow my bitter anger, wipe my face, go back to my front desk job, and desperately try to pick up the shattered pieces of my life.
About a month after Arthur's incredibly sad funeral, as I was slowly trying to find a new normal, a heavy, cream-colored envelope arrived in our small mailbox, explicitly addressed to me. I immediately noticed it bore the embossed, shiny gold seal of a very prominent law firm located deep in the wealthy financial district of the city. I just stood in the hallway staring at the envelope for a very long time, my heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Why on earth would a massive corporate law firm be contacting a receptionist? The very first thought that popped into my head was that my mother had finally tracked me down and decided to legally permanently sever any lingering ties I had to the family name. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely manage to tear the thick paper open. Inside was a very formal, rigidly typed letter from a senior managing partner, formally requesting my immediate, mandatory presence at their downtown office for the official reading of the last will and testament of one Mr. Arthur Pendleton. I was completely, utterly confused. Arthur didn't have anything of value. His only belongings fit inside a soggy cardboard box. What kind of official will could he possibly have?
Despite my immense confusion, I took a deep breath, put on my absolute best thrift store dress, and took the crowded subway all the way down to the wealthy financial district. The law firm was located in a towering, intimidating glass skyscraper. Walking into the massive marble-floored lobby, surrounded by people in suits that cost more than I made in a year, I felt completely out of place. The perfectly groomed receptionist directed me to a private elevator that shot straight up to the top floor. When the polished metal doors finally slid open, I was instantly greeted by incredibly thick carpets, expensive original art, and a breathtaking view of the entire sprawling city below. It felt exactly like the suffocating world I had been violently kicked out of 10 long years ago. The senior partner, a stern-looking man named Mr. Harrison, warmly greeted me and ushered me into a massive, imposing conference room. And that is the exact moment my blood ran cold and my feet froze to the floor. Sitting impatiently at the far end of the impossibly long mahogany table were my mother, Eleanor, and my brother, David.
I honestly couldn't believe my eyes. They looked absolutely terrible, completely devoid of their usual arrogant glow. My mother, who was usually perfectly composed, looked deeply exhausted. Her face was heavily lined with intense stress, and her posture was defeated and slumped. David looked like a nervous wreck, constantly checking his massive gold watch and rapidly tapping his shoe against the floor in agitation. When they finally looked up and saw me walk into the room, their eyes widened in absolute shock and horror. "What in God's name is she doing here?" my mother instantly snapped, her voice returning to that same freezing tone of authority that used to terrify me as a child. "Who let her into this meeting?" David jumped up from his chair, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "Listen here, Mr. Harrison. We are here to desperately discuss the restructuring of our company's massive debt with the new majority shareholder. We do not have the time or patience for ridiculous family drama today. Get her out of this building right now." Mr. Harrison didn't even blink. He calmly adjusted his expensive glasses, politely gestured for me to sit down in the chair opposite them, and looked dead at my furious brother. "She stays right where she is, David, because she is the sole reason you are sitting in my office today." I sat down very slowly, my mind racing. Mr. Harrison calmly opened a thick leather folder and began to strictly explain that over the past 5 agonizing years, my family's once mighty real estate empire had been slowly bleeding millions of dollars due to terrible investments and my brother's reckless management. They were teetering on the absolute verge of total catastrophic bankruptcy. A few months ago, an anonymous private investor had systematically bought up all of their toxic debt and quietly acquired the controlling majority shares of the entire company, effectively becoming their absolute boss. My family had been frantically trying to secure a meeting with this mysterious investor to beg to keep their lucrative positions.
Mr. Harrison paused, looked down at the documents, and then looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes. The anonymous investor who saved your failing company was my longtime client, Mr. Arthur Pendleton. He made a massive fortune in early tech investments decades ago, but chose to live a simple life as a janitor. By the time he passed away, his net worth was in the hundreds of millions. He bought your debt, and he owned your company. The silence in the room was so heavy you could cut it. David laughed nervously, calling it a scam, but Mr. Harrison silenced him immediately. Mr. Harrison then picked up a crisp piece of paper. Mr. Pendleton's final will is very clear. I leave my entire estate, including all financial holdings and the controlling shares of the Eleanor and David corporate group, to the one person who showed me true kindness when she had nothing to gain. I leave absolutely everything to my daughter in spirit, Sarah. I violently gasped, covering my mouth as hot tears instantly flooded my eyes. I was now the absolute owner of the empire that had violently cast me out. David erupted, screaming and slamming his fists, threatening to sue. But Mr. Harrison coldly informed him that the trust was legally ironclad, and contesting it would result in immediate personal bankruptcy. Defeated, my mother's terrifying ice queen persona melted into a desperate puddle. She forced a sickeningly sweet smile and whispered, "Sarah, my beautiful, sweet girl, we made mistakes, but we are family. We can run this company together." I stared into her panicked eyes, feeling Arthur's quiet strength filling my lungs. "Do not ever call me your sweet girl," I said in a calm, steady voice. "I lost my family 10 years ago, but I found a real family on a freezing bus bench when you threw an innocent old man out into the rain."
I turned to the lawyer. "Mr. Harrison, please immediately draft the final termination papers for both Eleanor and David. They are officially fired from all executive positions effective this second. I want them legally evicted from the company-owned mansion by the end of this month. They will absolutely not see another single penny from this corporation ever again." My mother let out an agonizing sob, violently burying her face in her hands. David just stared blankly at the wall, his arrogant identity completely shattered. I didn't feel a malicious joy, I just felt a profound sense of absolute justice. I walked out of that building feeling incredibly light. I immediately fired the toxic executives, restructured the entire business to ensure fair wages for all employees, and sold the family mansion. I used all the funds to completely build and open a massive community center and free housing shelter in the exact neighborhood where Mia and I used to struggle. We proudly named it the Arthur Pendleton House. Today, Mia is the director, and I finally get to teach underprivileged children, living a beautiful, peaceful life exactly as I always dreamed. Looking back on this unbelievable journey, the greatest lesson I learned wasn't about the power of money or corporate justice. It was about the undeniable, world-changing power of basic human kindness. A single act of compassion, offering a warm cup of tea to a shivering old man, completely and permanently rewrote the stars of my entire life. I learned the hard way that true wealth is absolutely not measured by the empty numbers in a bank account, but by the loyal people who willingly stand by your side when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your company. If my family had shown even a tiny fraction of the kindness Arthur possessed, they would still have their massive empire today. But they chose greed and cruelty, and it ultimately cost them absolutely everything they valued in this world. You have to ask yourself, when you see someone struggling in the cold rain, do you walk past them, or do you stop and offer your umbrella? Would you do the same in my place? Until the next story.